"Ah, children," said Mother Brown Bat, "it will soon be time to go to bed. And we shall sleep well, for bats are good sleepers. We shall sleep especially well if it is to be a cold winter. Ah, my children, what marketing trips we have made. I have not had to call in a neighbor to take care of my babies when I went out. No, my babies hung onto my neck and came along, too. What times we used to have catching bugs and other delicious delicacies. We found about at night. What meals we used to have. We used to have beetle pudding quite often and gnat salad. Do you remember, my bat babies? We remember, Mother Brown Bat. But, they said, we are no longer babies. That is true, said Mother Brown Bat, and you are able to look after yourselves. But I still call you babies, for it is hard for a mother to realize her children are grown up, and you do grow up so quickly. Sometimes we went about in the very, very early mornings, and often we started out before it was really night. But we took great care, for we kept away from people. People have such a curious habit of not liking bats. That is hard to believe, said the bat children. I think so, said Mother Brown Bat. I should think they would like bats, and especially the members of our family, for we are so small and dainty and so clever in the way we hang on to the trees when we sleep, rather than fussing about housekeeping and bed making all the time. Housekeeping takes up too much time for a Mother Brown Bat, and the Mr. Brown Bat and the little brown bats wouldn't half appreciate it either. So she doesn't bother to do a lot of work for no reason at all, for none of us miss a home life. We're perfectly happy as we are and with our own ways and habits. Perfectly happy, agreed the bat children. We're perfectly happy, Mother Brown Bat. There was once, said Witty Witch, as she sat in the center of old Mr. Giant's cave, and told stories to the elves, brownies, gnomes, goblins and many of her other little friends. A very naughty little gnome. I think slates are the nicest things in the world, he said. Anything we write or draw on them we can rub right out again. I guess I'll be like a slate myself. I'll do what I please and then I'll rub it out. Of course he didn't quite know how he was to do that. Rubbing out chalk marks on his slate he found to be quite a different matter from rubbing out mean and naughty actions. Still he said to himself that he would never do the same naughty things again, and that he was sorry, and that was just about the same as rubbing them out. He always pretended in school that he knew the answer to every question. Then, when Professor Gnome would ask what he had written, he would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, Professor, but I didn't know you wanted me to keep the answer on my slate. I rubbed it out," for then, he thought, he had shown he knew something by writing on his slate, even though he did not write the answer at all, but simply something quite absurd. One night he was very tired. He had been playing hard and had quite forgotten about his lessons. He had also knocked down a little creature smaller than himself, but he had said to himself that he was sorry for that. He really hadn't meant to be so rough. Suddenly before his eyes he saw Professor Gnome, only he looked much bigger than he did in school. He was carrying a big slate. "This is a slate which cannot be rubbed off by your sponge, little gnome," he said. "I have the magic rubber for it which the Fairy Queen gave me. You can now do your lessons correctly on this slate, and when I think they are well done then I shall take your slate and rub it clean." And the little gnome seemed to be back in the schoolroom now, and he had written something on his slate, just to pretend he knew the answer, and then he tried to rub it off before Professor Gnome saw it. But it wouldn't rub at all, and all the class laughed at him for knowing absolutely nothing. Next it was recess time, and the little gnome he had knocked down was crying. He had bumped his head as he had fallen, and the bump kept growing larger and larger until at last his head had gone entirely, and there was only a big bump left. Oh, how the gnome felt. "I shall always remember that I can't rub out everything I do," he said. "My magic slate will teach me a good lesson, for I'll be so ashamed when I see all my mistakes right in front of me until I have made them really and truly right." "It was only a dream, to be sure," said Witty Witch, but from that day on the gnome worked and played as though everything he did and said could not be washed off unless everything was right. "There was once," said Daddy, "a little boy named Peter who had always longed to see the man in the moon. Every night when there was a full moon he would sit at his window and look at the funny, jolly face of the old man until he became so sleepy he would have to go to bed. One night he sat watching so long that he fell asleep by the window. It was not long before he saw the strangest thing. The moon seemed to be growing larger and larger, and soon it was back of a tree near his window. He could see quite plainly the jolly old face of his beloved man in the moon, looking jollier and fatter than ever. The old man grinned from ear to ear at Peter, and in a moment or two he spoke. "Well, Peter, here I am. Now how do you like me?" And as he spoke he chuckled and laughed. "Oh, I think you're wonderful," said Peter, with wild enthusiasm and joy. So you think I'm wonderful, do you? Ha, ha, well, that is a joke. But there certainly isn't anyone else just like me, that's true enough. So maybe I'm wonderful because I'm so queer. What about that? Oh, no, said Peter, you're wonderful because you're so fat and jolly and because you're always laughing and seeming to have a good time. At that, the old man in the moon laughed some more and said, well, you're a funny little chap too. All folks don't think it's such a compliment to be fat, but I do. It's the way I am, you see, and it's best to be satisfied with the way you are, isn't it? If you really like me, then I'll take you off in my chariot of mist to visit the stars, and you'll call on all the bright queens of the stars, who sparkle so you can see them from down on the earth. So off went Peter with the man in the moon for the most gorgeous trip. They visited all the stars, saw the bright fairy queens who live in them and all the little elves and brownies. And then the man in the moon showed Peter where he stayed in the sky and how he moved every week so that all the little boys and girls in the world could see a full moon every month, and Peter could see down below all the wee little houses. They looked so small from where Peter was, and the earth, which looked very funny and small, too, from up in the moon. Peter felt a little afraid at first that he'd fall, but as he'd never heard of the man in the moon having a tumble to earth, he felt comforted. Alas, all too soon the journey had to end, for Peter heard the distant sound of a breakfast bell. As he yawned, he realized he'd been sleeping all night by the window. But, oh, such a gorgeous sleep as it had been. Her name was Dinah, said Daddy, and she was a gorilla. A gorilla is a relation of the monkey family, you know, and looks something like a chimpanzee. She had had quite an interesting life as she had lived in Africa when young, and then she had been captured and had been tamed and had been very friendly with her owner, and after that she was brought over to this country and given to a zoo in a large city. I don't expect to stay here very long, said Dinah. I do not care about living to a great old age, as some creatures do, and I do not like captivity. I am different from the orangutan and the chimpanzee, who are so friendly with the keeper. I do not object to the keeper, but life bores me. There are some creatures who are always happy, and if they aren't always happy, they are happy most of the time. So look at me while you can. Now is your chance to see the gloomy gorilla. Illustration. Peter felt a little afraid at first that he'd fall, page 270 Billy Brownie had still many of his calls to make in order to say good winter to his friends who were going to sleep for the winter. Googie room, googie room, googie room, said Grandpa Frog from the nearby pond. Come, little frogs, come all, and sleep in the beautiful mud. The cold weather is coming. It was bitterly cold last night, little frogs. Then he saw Billy Brownie. Good winter, croaked Grandpa Frog. And the toads and the frogs all squealed and croaked. Good winter, Billy Brownie. Good winter. Then Billy Brownie went to call on the jumping mice. That frost last night was a hard one, said little Miss Julia jumping mouse. I'm going to bed to take care of my mouse beauty sleep. Ha, ha, laughed Miss Jenny jumping mouse. Who ever heard of a mouse going to bed early to get her beauty sleep? I can't stop to talk it over with you. I'm too sleepy, said Miss Julia jumping mouse. Good winter to all of you, said Billy Brownie. But as he walked away from all his friends who were going to sleep for the winter, he said to himself, to sleep for a night is quite all right, but to sleep half a year is really quite queer. But of course we're all different, as different can be, and what is natural to you might seem very queer to me. A number of rich ladies, began Daddy, at the seashore one day last summer had been throwing pennies from a bridge into the water for a lot of poor boys who were diving for them. The water was quite a good deal over their heads, but the little boys were marvelous divers and swimmers, having always lived by the water. The ladies kept on throwing pennies time and time again to see the wonderful dives the little boys were able to make. They would dive straight down into the water and stay down ever so long and then come up, each one holding a glittering bright penny. But, alas, a dreadful thing happened. One of the ladies in throwing pennies dropped a most beautiful diamond ring off from her finger and into the deep water. Oh, dear, she cried in dismay, that was the ring I valued most and cared more for than any piece of jewelry I had. I shouldn't have worn it, though, for it was much too loose for that finger. Whatever shall I do without it? I was so fond of it. At once the little boys offered to dive for it, for it had been by the throwing of pennies to them that the lady had lost her much prized ring, and they wanted, of course, to get it back for her. So again and again they dived, but as none of them had seen her drop it, they couldn't judge where it had been dropped. Now, Toody Ruggles was perhaps the best little diver of all, and yet, even he had been so far unsuccessful, but at last he thought he saw it, shining down among some weeds. The lady, however, had just about given up hopes of ever seeing her ring again when, lo and behold, up came Toody, his wet little face wreathed in smiles, carrying the beautiful ring. The lady was overpowered with joy and gave Toody a most wonderful reward. Oh, how happy Toody Ruggles was! At home he had one little sister who was very fragile and delicate. As their parents had both died, Toody was trying his best to look after his sister and himself by selling newspapers and carrying suitcases from the station. Lately, though, the doctor had told him that his sister must have plenty of fruit to build her up and to make her regain her strength, and this poor Toody was unable to afford. But now he had the wonderful reward from the lady, and all the other boys were delighted that Toody had been the lucky one. Toody at once began to give his little sister delicious fruits. Soon the color came back to her cheeks, and she grew well and strong. So Toody's worry that he might lose his beloved little sister was over, and through his good luck their little home once more became very, very happy. A limpet, said Daddy, is a little shellfish. They're very, very small, perhaps a shade smaller than a snail, and they cling to the rocks which are their homes. There are always hundreds of them fastened on the big rocks on the coast by the sea. They live on seaweed and the salt water. When I was a boy we spent some time in a town by the sea. We used to play off a bank called Green Bank, because in the summertime this bank was always so very green. Below this bank there were countless big rocks. We could hide behind these rocks, and no one could see us. We loved that because it seemed so mysterious to hide like that. We could see the bank above us, and then, miles and miles, as far as we could see, was the ocean. The rocks were covered with seaweed, and they used to be very slippery. Sometimes we would play hide and seek back of these rocks. The rocks that were half in the water would be covered with the limpets. One big rock had great numbers of them on it, and we always called the rock, Limpet Rock. One Saturday about 6 of us had taken a big basketful of lunch and had gone down to Greenbank to spend the day. There had been a terrific storm the night before. We looked for our Limpet Rock the first thing, but we saw not a sign of a limpet. How funny, we thought, that surely is the rock. What could have become of the limpets? They were quite used to storms, and surely they couldn't have been hurt by the storm of the night before. Suddenly we spied them. There they all were, looking very unhappy and clinging to little pebbles and rocks in the low water. Before the day was over, though, the limpets had attached themselves to another big rock. So we called this rock the New Limpet Rock. Once the limpets had fastened themselves to the new rock, they were just as happy as before, for they can change homes more easily than any other creatures and be happy. So I think we should admire the limpets because they are so brave and cheerful when they are driven from one home, and with practically no fuss they set about and get a new home right away. A little girl named Fanny, began Daddy, was walking across a city street carrying a very small black poodle dog in her arms. Suddenly the poodle dog, whose name was Jip, saw another dog on the other side of the street. Evidently Jip thought the other little dog would be nice to talk to, so he jumped with one bound out of Fanny's arms. Fanny gave a scream of horror, at which the policeman, standing near, flew to the rescue. Had he been a minute later the little dog would have been struck by a streetcar. "Oh, you've rescued my little dog," Fanny cried. "You are so brave and wonderful." Jip, who had been very much frightened at his narrow escape, was breathing little short, quick breaths from the fear of a moment before. But at the same time his little tail was wagging for all it was worth, as he wanted to show the big policeman how much he thanked him, for he knew the policeman had saved his little dog life. A little boy named Bobby had a sister named Agnes, said Daddy. They had few neighbors, as they lived in a very small place where there were only a few houses. Near their house were long stretches of woods. They had never been to the other side of the woods, nor had they ever really walked very far into the forest, for it was said in the little hamlet where they lived that a queer old man had a hut about 1.5 miles through the long lonely road. But one day the children decided they'd venture forth to see this old man. Off they started, and after walking quite a distance they came to a funny little hut with smoke coming out of the chimney. When the old man saw Bobby and Agnes he called out in a happy, excited voice, "I'm having visitors. Hurrah!" He took the children in his hut and showed them some wonderful picture books. He told them how delighted he was to have visitors, as he knew he was thought queer, but really he wasn't at all, except that he loved to live in the heart of the woods. So the children promised to see him often, and he promised to show them more picture books, and before they left he gave them each a big piece of delicious apple pie. Once when I was a little boy, began Daddy, I heard an interesting story that a pin told. Now, you may think that a pin could not tell such a very good story, but this was an exceptional pin, belonging to a very grand person. Having been made into a beautiful crown-shaped pin of superb pearls, said the pin, I was put into a showcase in a very beautiful jewelry shop. People would notice me above all other pins in the case and pick me out as being by far the most beautifully set pin. All the pearls which belonged to me were very, very lovely ones. But I was so expensive that people could just look at me and could not afford to buy me. The jeweler was so proud of me that he really did not care whether I was sold or not, for my beauty attracted so much attention that it was a help to his business. You see, people would ask one another if they had seen me, and if they hadn't they would come right to the shop to look at me. Then, though they didn't buy me, they would be sure to buy something else in the shop. But at last a marvelous carriage drove up before the door. It was drawn by 4 horses, and there were 2 fine coachmen and 2 very pompous-looking footmen sitting up on top of the fine carriage. The jeweler was all in a flutter. Never before had he seen such a wonderful carriage, and out of it stepped a very handsomely dressed lady with a lady on either side of her, who both guarded her very carefully. The queen has come to my little shop, cried the excited jeweler, and all the other shoppers stood by and made low bows. But I didn't bow. I didn't think a crown need bow. The queen had heard of me, and she had come to buy me. The jeweler, with trembling fingers, fastened me in my little blue velvet box, and off I went, carried by the queen. When we reached the palace I felt very much at home, for everything was so beautiful there. I must confess, though, that I did feel a little nervous that first evening when I was worn by the queen with so many other exquisite jewels. Oh, but such times as I did have. The court dinners and balls and receptions were so dazzling, and I adored them. But, best of all, I loved the parades and seeing all the crowds of people cheer and wave their handkerchiefs to the queen. And the bands were so exciting. But the proudest moment of my life was really when the queen gave me to a young lady as a token of her appreciation of the lady's brave soldier Daddy.